Good morning and welcome to our service this morning on this April 16th. It's a day we've been looking forward to, a day that's been circled around our house with some stress and anxiety, but we're happy it's here. Typically, if we're talking about April 16th, it means a couple things in my house, probably means a couple things in your house. One is, if you haven't filed your taxes, you're in trouble. But I think this year we may have a couple days. I haven't talked with my resident CPA in our house as she walks in. And I think you get a couple extra days to file your taxes. The other thing it means in our house is it's Stolanda's birthday. So it's been a big day around our house for a lot of years, and today is no change to that. Again, welcome if you're here visiting with us this morning. As Michael mentioned, it's good to see faces we haven't seen in a while, and it's good for you guys to be here and worship with us. And we hope that the things we do and say this morning and the thoughts that we bring can somehow, hopefully, help you in your Christian walk. I'm going to talk for just a minute this morning about being afraid. You know, we've all had times in our lives where we have things in our lives that make us afraid. Sometimes those things are real. Sometimes those things are not real. I can remember a time back in around 1988 or so. A lot of you know Bud Jones and Margaret and their family, and we were very close to their family. They were living in Tishomingo at the time, and so I was down there visiting David. And if you know much about Tishomingo in the late 80s, many years prior to today, back then marijuana was not legal. And Tishomingo was the marijuana capital of Oklahoma, if I'm not mistaken. Johnston County was very active in the production of that. And so there were a lot of unsavory people, if you will, that lived in that area and produced those things and did those kind of things. Well, one weekend I was down there visiting David, and for whatever reason, I was asleep in Bud Margaret's home, and I was asleep in their living room. So I don't know why David didn't let me sleep in his bed, or maybe I don't know what happened. But anyway, we were in the living room asleep, and I was kicked back in the recliner like you can imagine, just snoring away, and something woke me up. At about, I don't know what time it was, but it was early in the morning. Something woke me up, and as I kind of came to my senses and looked around, there was somebody crawling beside my chair. And you can imagine, at that time I was probably 18, 19, 20 years old. I'm not sure I had ever experienced fear, but I experienced fear that night. So I watched this body, crawl alongside that chair, and I'm just sweating, and I'm not moving. I mean, I'm still as I can be because I'm scared to death. And then soon after, somebody else comes walking or crawling into the living room there, and they kind of stand up, and they're communicating to each other very quietly. And I'm getting really scared now. I don't know where anybody's at. I don't know how these people got in the house. And I am just sitting there in panic and in fear. That paralyzing type of fear. And I sat there for, I don't know, what seemed to be 6 or 7 hours, but probably 5 or 6 minutes. And I thought, what am I going to do? I wasn't ready for my life to end, but I sure thought it was getting ready to end, and I was paranoid. And so after a few minutes of sitting there and going through it and watching these beings crawl around on the ground, I was like, I got to do something. I guess if this is my day, this is my day. And so I sat up really quick and was ready to engage. And I noticed the person that was crawling on the other side of the room was a plant, standing up. And obviously the people around me disappeared. But I was afraid, and it was real. Even though it wasn't really real, but I had that fear. A few years later, a day that all of us will remember around here, May 20th of 2013. if we remember that day, that was the day the tornadoes came through. And I can remember being at work and starting to hear the tornadoes and the storms. I know there's many people in this room that were affected very heavily by those. And as I was driving home, I had a fear. I had a fear of what was going to happen. My kids were spread out. I think we were in 3 different schools. Delonda was with one of them at one school. And I had no idea what we were going to do or what I was going to find. But I had a fear. Now, that fear was real. My fear of people crawling around on the room and on the floor obviously wasn't real. But that day, there was a real fear. And a lot of people's lives got turned upside down that day. And we can go on with instances and things that happen in that fear. Sometimes it's real, sometimes it's not real, but it generally has the same effect and same impact on us. You know, as we look into the scriptures, we've been studying the life of Christ here on Wednesday nights for the last year and a half, 2 years or so. And as we've been doing that, it's became more interesting to me the words that Jesus spoke. You know, he wasn't here that long. We don't have a record of the things that he did for a very long period of time. So those words that he spoke to us that we've got captured in the Bible are extremely important and very valuable to us. And I was doing some research, and I found that while Jesus was here on this earth and what we have captured for us in the Holy Scriptures, Jesus asked 307 questions of people. 307 questions. And so I got to thinking to myself, if Jesus asked those questions of people, it's probably pretty important for me, for us, to dig into those questions. What was he asking? Why? What was the response? And so this morning, for just a few minutes, we're going to talk about one of those questions that Jesus asked his disciples that were around him at the time. That question is, why are you so afraid? We're going to pick this example up in the book of Mark, chapter 4 and verse 35. I want to set the stage of what was going on there. Jesus had spent the day teaching. And if you remember, he was around the Sea of Galilee. There was a large crowd around him, so he got in a boat and kind of set off into the lake and there, and where people could hear him and he could talk and he would not be pushed in by the crowds. And he taught all day. Now, this boat they got into, a lot of times it's challenging for me to really think about a boat, a ship. We think about fishermen. We think about that time in Jesus' life, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. The boat he was in was about 27 foot, apparently, according to some research I've done and things that people have done for boats at those times and fishermen, about 27 foot. So not a ship by any means, but a boat. The beam on those things, the width of those boats was generally about 7.5 feet. So Jesus is on a boat, and these apostles or disciples are on a boat that's about 28 feet long and about 7 feet wide. So not a huge boat. You know, as Jesus had been teaching that day, at the end of the day, with being tired and wore out, he wanted to go across the sea. So he asked his disciples there, let's go across the sea. And so they set out to go across the sea to the other side on the Sea of Galilee. And as they were going across, and there were some other ships following them, or boats following them, as they were going across, this great storm came up. And as this storm comes up, we find the disciples here. We'll pick up in verse 38. It says, but he was in the stern, asleep. So as this storm comes up, the waves crashing, the waves coming over the boat filling up with water, the terror that's in there, the fear that these disciples had, they go and they see Jesus asleep. He was asleep, in the stern of the boat, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, Why are you so afraid? Jesus asked the question to those disciples there, why are you so afraid? The same question I asked myself when I stood up or sat up in David's living room that night. Well, why are you so afraid? I didn't have a reason to be afraid. And I think as we dig into this story this morning, we'll learn from what we can glean from these few verses why they were afraid. They had a real danger there. And maybe dig into a little bit more of this question that Jesus asked them. You know, if you've ever been on a boat or a ship that's been out to sea, you can understand what these disciples were feeling and going through. Back a few years ago, we used to have a boat, and we would go to Lake Arbuckle. And Lake Arbuckle is a pretty small lake, and so it never had big waves, didn't have anything that was very scary or very challenging to us, and we could go out there. Well, as we typically did, we would get bored with doing that, and so we wanted to go to another lake, and we went to Lake Texoma. And I know some of you have been on Lake Texoma. Some of you probably spent a lot of time on Lake Texoma. But for us, this was our first time, and I can remember going into the marina there where we put the boat in. And I went in and checked in and paid my dues and did all that. And the lady was there, and she said, well, you know, I think she asked me, how comfortable you are on this lake? And I said, well, I've never been on this lake before. And she said, oh. And she kind of looked at me and said, well, we've got a storm coming up. I said, okay. And it's a beautiful day. I said, okay. She said, well, you just need to be careful, because if you get caught out in the lake when that storm comes up, you're going to be in trouble. And I was like, well, okay. At this point, I was not sure how young I was, younger than I am now. And I didn't think much about that. And so we set off for the day. And the way we went to the lake, and the boys can attest to this, when we went to the lake, we went out on the water, and we were there a long time. And we were there. We were out. We were having fun, having a good time playing in the water. And I kind of see this storm building up in the back. And I have no idea where we're at on this lake. I don't know if GPS was around at that time. We didn't have it. I had no idea where I was at. Didn't know how to read a map. And I could see it coming. And I was starting to get a little nervous. And so we kind of pile up and get back in the boat, and we start heading for the shore. And I'm telling you, those waves were big. That lady that at the marina was not lying. There were huge waves, and they're starting to crash in the boat, and I'm getting a little panicked. I'm not going to lie to you. And I think that's what these disciples were seeing. Some of that, the waves crashing over. Now, I guess maybe to equate this in some way, if we were doing that and I was asleep in the boat and the boys were trying to do all this, I'm sure they'd have been really mad at me for sleeping and scared. And I think that's maybe what the disciples felt. They're going through this and they see Jesus sleeping, and they're kind of anxious, and they ask him, what are you doing? Do you not care? And we'll dig into that a little bit later, but this is a pretty challenging scene for the disciples as they are fighting through these waves and they think they're about to die. You know, fear is a pretty common emotion that we all have, and we have quite a lot. I was doing some research, and I found that there are over 500 documented phobias in this world that have been documented by our mental health professionals in the mental health industry. So I want to talk just about a few of them that I think it's interesting. But Conchecotelephobia. And these words, you'll notice they get shorter as we go on, because I got tired of pronouncing these big words. But this word, and somebody may know what this phobia is, and some of you may experience it. I experience it a little bit every once in a while, but it's the fear of chopsticks. And if you think about the fear of chopsticks, there are probably some people in this room that can use them and use them really well. I cannot. So when I think about going to a sushi restaurant or a Chinese or Japanese restaurant where people use those things, I get paranoid because I can't do it and everybody else does. So there's a lot of different phobias. Here's another one. I told you I shouldn't do this. Arachibutyrophobia. Now this one, maybe some people experience this, but this is the fear of peanut butter getting stuck to the roof of your mouth. So, and I think maybe I did a little, I'm not sure, you start going down rabbit holes. Went down this rabbit hole about this one, and it's a fear mainly of people getting a fear of choking. So I guess I can understand that. I don't like peanut butter very much, and maybe this is why I've got a arachibutyrophobia problem. There's also another documented called somniphobia. And you could probably figure this one out if you thought about it a little bit, but this is the fear of sleeping. Now, in our house, we don't have a fear of sleeping. We can sleep about through anything. We don't fall or into that category a whole lot. And then finally, anthophobia. You may have a guess of what that is. This one was a little bit more difficult for me to understand. But it's the fear of flowers. So, like I said, the words got smaller as we went down so I could pronounce them better. But I say all this to say, and if somebody suffers from those things, obviously I'm not poking fun at those at all. I just want to kind of give us an idea of how our society that we live in copes with these types of things. And they're real. And there's a lot of them. Like I said, there's over 500 documented known phobias. But you know the reality, the world we live in, all this fear has caused us to be one of the most worrisome cultures in the world. That anxiety that we talk about, that fear comes into our lives and steals our joy and replaces it with panic. Think about that, the fear, what it steals from us, what God expects us to have, the life that He wants us to live. This fear, anxiety takes that away from us. You know, we can look at our story that we read this morning with Jesus' disciples there. They kind of fell apart when things seemed to be out of their control. When they lost control is when they started looking around and started trying to point fingers and started trying to question how we were going to make it out of this. You know, the Sea of Galilee there, the specific geographic location of the sea makes it particularly susceptible, I guess, from what I was reading, to these sudden storms that come up. But the way it's centered down low and those kind of things. One thing I was reading, and obviously the disciples that Jesus had there with him were experienced sailors. I mean, they knew how to sail. They knew what was going on. They knew the sea. They knew those things. But they said, some of the research I did said that the Sea of Galilee, particularly in the evenings and early mornings when they would have been sailing, was generally very still, generally very calm. But when those storms did come up, when those storms did happen, they were usually worse and stronger and more fierce. If we look over into the book of Matthew, his account of this event, he uses a Greek word called seismos to describe this storm, which gives us an idea of what the power that was in this storm, the things that the disciples were going through there. I think as we read through it, we can find that fear that those disciples had as understandable. This rebuke of Jesus. And as I studied this more, I read some, I take it and look at it a little bit different way. And really what the disciples are doing there is rebuking Jesus. He says, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Don't you care if we drown?" They were afraid, and they had a legitimate fear, but they didn't know who was in the boat with them. Sometimes we do that. We forget who's in our boat. Found it interesting that Matthew and Luke don't even mention these words, this rebuke. Mark does. The disciples there didn't know. They let their fear, they let these circumstances overwhelm who they were. And we see Jesus waking up, rebuking the wind and the seas. And I have in my mind this picture of this calm body of water again. We can see the waves in my mind, in my view of this picture. The waves are starting to calm down as they go out. You can see the calmness that's around them. The sovereign Lord spoke, and his creation immediately responded. When Jesus asked them about, "O ye of little faith, why are you so afraid?" I think he was questioning their faith in him. I know he was questioning their faith in him. If they knew who was on that boat, they shouldn't have feared. But like I said, their cry is the ultimate cry of fear, of doubt, abandonment, that's repeated often in the Scriptures. We can look through the Old Testament and Psalms. Where is the God in the midst of my distress? Has God abandoned his people? The cry goes out all the time. And it's a cry that goes out in our society, in our culture today, each and every day. A cry that unfortunately goes up in my life many times as those storms come. We think to ourselves, if God is so great and powerful, if God really cares about his world and his creation, then why do these events happen? Why do things in my life go so terribly wrong? You know, when we start questioning those things, and people in the world start questioning those things, you get to really two possible answers. Those answers are either God has no power or God doesn't care. That's really where you end up when you start questioning those things and you let that doubt creep into your life. Either God has no power or God doesn't care. What did those disciples ask Jesus? Do you not care? Do you not care that we're perishing? We come to the same conclusion that those disciples come to. So I want to talk for just a few more minutes on something called storm theology. And storm theology is what you believe about God when storms come into your life. When a crisis comes into your life, is God a good God or a bad God? When you pray during those storms, do you see God as caring or uncaring? You know, the way we react to God during a storm really reveals the truth about ourselves. When we have storms that come into our life, and when I think about a storms, these are the tests we have in our lives. When things aren't going well. When maybe we've lost a loved one. Maybe we've got an incurable disease. Maybe we've got challenges at work that are real challenges, that are really tough and hard to deal with. Maybe we have things within our family that are hard to deal with. These are the storms that come into our life. And what these storms do, really, they tell us a lot about ourselves. When that pressure is on us, who we are will come out. Read an illustration about a sponge. And you may have heard this before, but if I had a sponge and put it on the table here in front of me, you might could tell that it was full of something. If I had used that sponge to soak up a liquid, you could probably tell it was full of something. But you wouldn't know what. Just like when people look at us, everybody knows we've all got an inside, a personality. But until that person got put under pressure, you really don't know what's inside that person. That sponge is the same way. It can be sitting there, and you can tell it's full, but until you put pressure on it, you won't know what's inside of it. You won't know if it's milk or water or Coke or whatever. These storms really do that for us. And if you think about it, when you've gone through times in your life that we would characterize and quantify as a storm, when you look back at how you handled those things, it tells you a lot about yourself. These storms are coming, and they're going to come. If we look back into the book of Job in chapter 14, Job there praying to God mentions that life is full of trouble. We're going to have troubles. In John chapter 16 and verse 33, Jesus says, "Here on this earth you will have many trials and sorrows." We're going to have tests. We're going to have storms. So the real question is how do we deal with those things? How do we react to those? Some things about storms that we all know is they happen fast. Just like these disciples that were going across the lake on the boat that at that time was probably very calm and smooth. And before they know it, here's a storm. And now they're in it. And they're dealing with it. Those things happen to us in our lives. I would venture to say many in this room have gotten a call late at night. And that call changed your life. And that call put you into a storm instantly. They happen fast. Whether we've walked into a doctor's office for a normal appointment, a normal checkup, and they come back with some bad news. Some life-changing, some life-altering news. All of a sudden, we find ourselves in a storm. Back on that day, on May 20th in 2013, I woke up like it was a normal day. You woke up like it was a normal day. Had no idea what was going to happen that day. And we found ourselves in a storm. They happen fast. Another thing about storms and their impact on us, they can cause us to doubt God. If you've lived any time on this earth and you've experienced a storm, you understand this. I think back to Thomas in John chapter 20. Famous doubting Thomas. There are people that have never stepped foot in a church service that know doubting Thomas because of what he did. But think about Thomas and the storm that he was in when he went through that. He'd been following this man for years, listening to him, had everything invested in him, and now he's gone. He's in a storm. And in that storm, Thomas let a little doubt creep in. Just like us today, storms can cause us to doubt God. Lastly, storms teach us about ourselves. We've already talked about the sponge. We talk about the disciples in the boat there, their questioning of Jesus. We talked about this a little bit. I think the Lord's rebuke is not about their reaction to the storm, but the reaction to Jesus in the storm. They question his love and concern for them. This is so often what we do, or what I do. When these storms come my way, I oftentimes doubt in God's love and concern for us, just like the disciples did. They doubted that Jesus cared for them. We do the same thing. We have that doubt. So here's the reality as we wind down this morning. Everyone here in this room is either in a storm getting ready to be in a storm, just coming out of a storm, acquainted with storms. I think maybe that's life, right? Life is full of storms. And when you come out of that storm, you're not going to be the same person that walked into that storm. When you come out of that storm, you're going to see Jesus differently. You're going to see God differently. You're going to see his love for us differently, either more favorable or less favorable. But when you come out of that storm, you're going to learn some things. Every storm in life is a learning lesson for us. As I look back over my years and I see those times when those things came into my life, whatever it was, we learned from them. We learned a lot. A few years ago, I can remember sitting at the table with Tripp and Sheridan, and it was about 3 years ago, actually, 3 years plus, right at the beginning of COVID. And Tripp and Sheridan were going to stay with us. And I remember sitting at the table, and I said, I'm not sure what this is going to look like, but we're going to come out of the other side, and how we are on the other side defines who we are. And they made it through those 6 weeks. We made it through those 6 weeks. Nobody died. There might have been some screaming and yelling and crying a couple times, but with the whole house there, we made it through. And that's what those storms do to us. They change us. We can rely on God and be changed in the appropriate way. So I want to look, as we close this morning, this last verse. And I talked to Delonda about this earlier this week, and we were kind of going through the story, and she did like I did, kind of finished the story of God, or Jesus, standing up and rebuking the winds and the waves, and everything was still, and life went on. And that's true. But this last verse, and I don't want to stand before you and make it sound like I'm so more enlightened now than I used to be, but I've read this story a lot of times. And I don't know that I've ever read this last verse. And I don't know that I've ever even thought about it. That's not necessarily that I'm more enlightened now, probably as an example of how less enlightened I've been. It says, and they were filled with great fear. I've never realized the fear. After everything is calm, everything is great, they were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? That's interesting, isn't it? Jesus called them out for being scared. But yet, Mark, as he sums this experience up, says they were filled with great fear. So that was interesting to me. So I started looking in, and the word that Jesus used and the word that Mark used are two different words. This word that Mark uses here in verse 41, this great fear is a fear of awe, a fear of God. And I think if we can take this example and look at the disciples and see how they entered the storm and how they exited the storm, it's a good example and a good pattern for us. They entered that storm scared. They exited that storm with the fear of God. That's our challenge to each of us this morning as we live our lives. Take some time as we enter these storms and be intentional about making sure we enter the other side like the disciples with the fear of God. Those are my thoughts this morning. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate everyone being here. We've not spoke on the first principles of salvation, but if there be one in the audience this morning that has been taught that plan and wants to enter into the kingdom through baptism, there's not a better time to do that, and we'll be happy to help you and assist you with that at this time. If there be one in the audience this morning that is going through those storms, and I know there are people that are going through storms, and if there's anything that this congregation can do, that we can do, is pray for you. And if you want those prayers this morning, we would ask one of either case to come while we stand and sing that song that's been selected.